Well, welcome back. Last week
for a while. I had a couple coffees at that time.
Good job. So last week we talked about Lewis's life really briefly, leading up to World War II, when he gave a series of radio talks, which eventually became Mere Christianity, what we're reading. And we jumped into chapter 1, where Lewis made two assertions. One, that people all throughout history and all across the world have had this idea that they can't shake, that people ought to behave in a certain way. And two, they do not in fact behave that way. Now, we're going to read chapters 2, 3, and 4, and a good chunk of it is just going to be addressing some objections. In fact, chapter 2 is titled Some Objections. Those two assertions are going to be our foundation for the month of June. And so Lewis says, let's make our foundation as strong as possible, because we want our foundation to be as strong as possible. And then chapter 3 will talk about the reality of the law, and chapter 4 is what lies behind the moral law. So we'll talk about some of the consequences of the existence of this law is, and we'll come across some more objections along the way. But to start with, we'll address some of the letters and complaints he got after his first radio talk. The first objection Lewis received was something along the lines of, isn't what you call the moral law just our herd instinct? And hasn't it evolved like all our other instincts? Lewis says, well, I don't deny that we probably have a herd instinct, like a natural desire, let's say, to care for other members of our herd or tribe. I've heard it said that humans are pack animals. So undoubtedly we do have an inbred's not the right word, an inherent desire to help people like us. Right? But that's not the same as the moral law. Right? Lewis says, we all know what being prompted by instinct feels like. Right? You have an instinct for food. All right? That's hunger. You have an instinct for sex. That's, let's say, sexual motivation. You have an instinct for safety. That's your sense of fear. Like, these are not, it's not quite appropriate to say that these are just desires or wants. Like, these are really deep-seated drives. Like, these aren't things you share with monkeys or dogs. These are things you share with fish and dragonflies. Like, these go deep, deep down in your psyche. Now, we probably do have a herd instinct, which is a desire or a want to help. But feeling a desire to help is not the same as feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. So here's an analogy from Lewis. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger. You will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. And two, the other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which of them should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that a sheet of music, which tells you at a given moment to play one note on a piano and not another, is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. Here's another way to look at it. If you have a person and they have two instincts inside them fighting, and that's all there is, clearly the stronger instinct is going to win. Pretty obviously. But the moral law tends to side with the weaker of our two instincts. You probably want to be safe more than you want to help the man that's in danger. And often we find that it's kind of our job to strengthen the, let's say, right instinct. Right? We kind of feel a duty that we need to wake up an instinct using our imagination or trying to arouse pity in yourself. Or we know the phrase, like, trying to get up steam. Like, you're going to do something rough and you're like, all right, I got to do this, and you're building up steam. All right? The thing telling you your herd instinct is asleep, wake it up, can't be your herd instinct. Here's a third way to look at it. If the moral law is just one of our instincts, then one of them should always be good. But none of them are. It's a mistake to think that we have good instincts, like the love a parent has for their child, or patriotism, to think those are good, and that things like sex and the fighting instinct are bad. It's often the duty of married people to arouse their sexual instinct, and just as it's the duty of a soldier to awaken his fighting instinct. And sometimes you need to suppress mother love or patriotism when it's being unfair to other people's children or to other countries. Lewis says, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as good and bad impulses. Think once again of a piano. It has not got two kinds of notes on it, the right notes and the wrong ones. Every single note is right at one time and wrong at another. The moral law is not any one instinct or set of instincts. It is something which makes a kind of tune, the tune we call goodness or right conduct, by directing our instincts. Lewis has a quick aside here and says, this is actually one of the most dangerous things you can do is take any one of your instincts and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. His example is, you might think love of humanity in general is pretty safe, but if you leave out justice, you'll find yourself committing perjury and faking evidence for the greater good.
We've kind of gone there.
Yeah.
More than kind of.
We should have all made our kids read Mere Christianity. It should have been required in the schools.
Mine would.
I think so too, which is kind of the point of the class.
Yeah.
The next objection that Lewis got a lot of was, isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that's been put into us by our parents and teachers and society? And Lewis says, well, I think there's a misunderstanding here. Yes, I don't doubt that our morality's been put into us by our parents and teachers and society, but it's a mistake to think that anything we learn in school is a mere human invention. We talked about this last week, but there are some things, like the multiplication table, that aren't human inventions. A child on a deserted island wouldn't know the multiplication table. But it's not like we could have made it any different if we wanted to. In fact, if someone did have a different multiplication table, you would probably say they got it wrong. Lewis says, I have two reasons for thinking that morality belongs in the category with mathematics instead of social convention. First reason is, we mentioned this last week, but you can see the same moral law running through all the moralities throughout history. Even though there's differences, they're much more similar than they are different. Unlike social conventions, things like clothing or what the rules of the road are, which can vary drastically depending on where you go. We drive on the right side of the road, but in other places you drive on the left. And that's not just different, that's the opposite. And we talked about last week, like there's no opposite morality anywhere in the world. But the second reason, and I think this is a much more solid reason, is whenever you think of two moralities, don't you tend to think of one of them as being better than the other? For example, let's take ancient Babylonian morality with child sacrifice and compare it to modern morality with whatever problems you think it has. Don't you think that it's gotten better, that there's been progress? We have one person saying no.
We still sacrifice children.
Yes.
It's the same.
All right, then let's compare Nazi morality to Civil War morality, American Civil War morality. Do you think one of them's better than the other? If not, there's no reason to prefer one morality over another. Say to prefer Christian morality over Nazi morality. So this is an idea I kind of want to dwell on for a minute because it took me a while to grasp, and once I did it, I found it super useful. There must be some real morality for the other moralities to be more or less like. So here's an analogy that Lewis uses. Let's say someone in this room says, imagine New York City. And so we try to imagine New York City. Now, your picture of New York City in your head might be better than mine. All right, maybe you've seen a map of New York, and so your picture in your head can actually lay out the roads more accurately, and I don't do as good a job as that. Or maybe you've seen more pictures, maybe you've studied the architecture, so you know more buildings in New York than I do. The point is that your picture of New York City in your head can be better than mine. And the reason it can be is because New York is a real place. Right? If you just said, imagine a city, neither of us could be more or less right than the other. But with New York in particular, if you say imagine it, one of us could be more correct than the other because New York is a real place. Similarly, with moralities, one can be more or less... Let me try that again. What we say by better or worse moralities means that they are approaching something real. There's something real for them to be more or less like. So Lewis concludes, despite people having different ideas about morality, and that suggesting that there's no real law, the inescapable thoughts we have about the different moralities proves the opposite. That if there are different ideas about morality, we cannot escape having certain reactions about those differences, and those reactions prove the opposite, that there's something real that we're basing these ideas off of. So, that is chapter 2. Some objections before we go on to chapter 3. Any questions? All right, chapter 3, the reality of the law. Did you have a question?
Oh, I mean, obviously, there is different people have different what they think is right.
Yeah.
They're going towards their reality, which may or may not be correct. Is that right?
Yeah.
So obviously we're going to try to get to how to get people to get to God's morality. Mm-hmm. The basic of what really is truth.
Yeah. So I would say people have different ideas for the right path. And I guess Lewis' assertions here is that people can be wrong about that. I might think the best way to get to Seattle is heading east on I-90. East doesn't take you to Seattle. I'm wrong about that. Mm-hmm. People have ideas about the best way to get to where they want to go, and people even disagree on where it is they want to go. And we'll get to that in future weeks. But
I think one of the points Lewis is making that can't be overlooked is that you and I may disagree about what we think is right, but inherent in humans is the idea that there is a right and wrong.
Right. Okay.
And that it doesn't matter how you, even sort of in a multicultural environment like we have now. So it's the assertion that, everybody can have their own truth, but then when you disagree with them, it's like, well, you really ought to think the way I do. That everybody has this idea that there is a truth, even in a multicultural society, that truth just becomes something different, and that since we all have inherent in us this idea that some things ought to be right or wrong, that reveals something about our makeup.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to jump into chapter 3 here, the reality of the law. Let's go back to our original 2 points. 1, people ought to behave well. 2, they do not. Well, Lewis says, you might have a reaction to me saying that. You might think, well, people aren't perfect, and why on earth should you expect them to be? Well, he says, my goal here was we're not trying to assign the exact amount of guilt to each person. We're looking for truth. And there are consequences to the idea of something not being what it ought to be. Let's look at nature here for a second. With a rock or a tree, there's no sense in saying it should have been otherwise. You might say that rock is a wrong rock, but what you mean by that is it's wrong for you to it's the wrong shape for you to put in a rockery. Or you might say that tree is a bad tree because it doesn't give you shade. But you know, unless you're a great fool, that given the weather and soil being what they were, and the rock or tree being what it is, it couldn't have been any different. A bad rock obeys the laws of nature just as much as a good rock. In fact, if we look at it that way, the laws of nature aren't really laws. They're just another way of saying what nature in fact does. You could just say they're the facts themselves. If you drop a stone, it doesn't suddenly remember that it's under orders to fall and then does so. It just does. As far as we can tell, there's nothing beyond what actually is. But with people, there are the facts, what we actually do, our real behavior, and then there's something else, what we ought to do. Now this is really so peculiar, Lewis says, you're tempted to explain it away. What if by bad people we just mean inconvenient, like we do with bad rocks and bad trees? Well, we're going to explore this idea here in a minute, but it doesn't really work to say what we call bad behavior in others is just what's inconvenient to us. So, let's say there's a good seat on a bus that I want. A person who's in that seat because they got on the bus before me, and a person who takes that seat when my back is turned and they move my bag in order to sit down are equally inconvenient to me, but I blame the second and I don't blame the first. Another example is I'm not angry with a person, except at first, who trips me on accident. I am angry with a person who tries to trip me on purpose and misses, but the first person has hurt me and the second person hasn't. Sometimes what we call bad behavior isn't even inconvenient to us, but the opposite. In war, both sides can find a spy useful, and even though they pay him and use him, they regard him as human vermin. And Lewis says, as for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it's pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have got 3 pounds. Doing schoolwork honestly when it would be easy to cheat. Leaving a girl alone when you would like to make love to her. Staying in dangerous places when you would rather go somewhere safer. Keeping promises you would rather not keep. And telling the truth even when it makes you look a fool. Now, some people have a counter to this, and this is one I found more in modern times, that decent conduct is not about our individual gains, but what benefits humanity as a whole. Right? People, after all, aren't stupid. We know that the only way to have a good society to live in is when everyone's being honest and fair and kind. And that's true. That is the only way you're going to have a world worth living in, is when everyone's doing it. But it kind of misses the question. All this means is that we ought to be unselfish. Our question is, why should I as an individual care about humanity as a whole? To quote Lewis, if we ask, why ought I be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society, we may then ask, why should I care about what's good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish. Which simply brings us back to where we started. You're saying what is true, but you're not getting any further. In the same way, if a man asks what is the point of behaving decently, it is no good replying, in order to benefit society. For trying to benefit society, in other words, other people, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you are really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior, which is true. You would have said just as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. And that is where I do stop. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, not that they like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. The moral law, or law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is simply a fact about how heavy objects act. On the other hand, it is not a mere fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about people would be reduced to nonsense if we did. It is not simply a statement about how we should like other men to behave for our own convenience. For the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient, and may even be the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you want to call it, must somehow or other be a real thing. A thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. And yet it is not a fact in the ordinary sense, in the same way that our actual behavior is a fact. It begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality. That, in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. So that was chapter 3. Any questions before we get into chapter 4, what lies behind the moral law?
So when he's saying that there is more than one kind of reality, it sounds like the bottom line is, though, that we are all trying to go to the same reality. You know what I'm saying? He said, and be quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing in on us.
I think what he's trying to do is create evidence for what we're going to get into next. Because we're starting at, we all agree that that the natural world, the scientific, observable, objective world is real. And some people stop there. So Lewis is trying to create evidence that in this case there's more than one kind of reality. Because the moral reality isn't objective, like our behavior is objective, but it is still real because we can't get away from it. Every way we come at it, we come across something that we can't break down. It's, as far as we can tell, it's real. We can't dismantle it like we could a fantasy. Okay.
So part of that is because each of us has our own filters that we look at reality. And Russ and I both think that gravity works great. Mm-hmm. But then when we start talking about Ford versus Chevy, it's a whole different issue. Different realities.
I'm not going to touch the Chevy debate. So, chapter 4. What lies behind the moral law? Well, we want to consider what we've talked about and what it tells us about the universe. And the reason we want to do this is, very roughly speaking, historically there have been two views of the universe. The first might be called the materialist view, that this universe is all there is and that we came about by kind of repeated chance. The other is the religious view, that there's something outside the universe that's more like a mind than anything else. Like a mind in the sense that it's conscious, that it has purpose and preferences. Don't think that one of these ideas is old and has slowly been replaced by the other. Lewis says, as long as there have been thinking men, both ideas have been held. You can find, though they weren't called atheists, for all intents and purposes, you can find, arose by any other name, you can find atheists in ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient Babylon. Right. This disagreement has gone back as long as people have been able to think. Also note, you can't determine which of these views is correct using science. Now, I'm going to do something right now that I'm not going to do very often, and that is I'm going to paraphrase Lewis. Because he's going to say something here which I think he does a decent enough job of, but I think some modern apologists do a little bit better. So I'm going to be quoting Tim Mackey, Sean McDowell, and Mike Winger, because this is an area that I think is fascinating. So, in a couple paragraphs here, Lewis essentially asks the question, is there anything real beyond the scope of science? Well, there's plenty of people who would say no, because that's just what the definition of science is. It's the study of what's objective, what we can agree on. It's a study of the real world. If you can't detect it scientifically, in what sense is it real? And if you want to take that view, it's like, all right, fair enough. But that's not an argument, that's an axiom. An axiom is your presupposed beliefs that you base your arguments from. And that's not a bad thing. Everyone has axioms. You can't get away from them. All right, if you try to get rid of all your axioms, you end up deconstructing yourself into nihilism and absurdity. So if someone says, no, science is just what's real because that's the definition, it's like, fair enough, but that's not an argument. That's just how you're defining your words. So here's an analogy I liked. How about the question, are there things that our eyes can't see? Hopefully you all said yes. There are things our eyes can't see. Air springs to mind. There's plenty of wavelengths of light, X-rays and infrared that you can't see. There are things that our eyes can't see. Did we discover those things using our eyes? Obviously not. We had to use something else to discover there were things our eyes can't see. We had to use scientific instruments. In a similar vein, are there things that science is blind to? Is a question science can't answer. Lewis says, the statement that there is something behind the universe and the statement that there is no such thing are neither of them statements that science can make. And real scientists do not usually make them. It is usually the journalists and popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half-baked science from textbooks who go in for them. After all, it's really a matter of common sense. Supposing science ever became complete, so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe. Is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Would remain just as they are? Now our situation would be hopeless in determining if there's anything outside of our universe, except for one thing. There's one thing we know more about than mere scientific observation would tell us. People. Right? We don't merely observe people like we observe the sciences. We are people. I like Lewis's word here. He says, we have, in a sense, inside information. Well, what do we find inside people? That they have this sense of a moral law, that they ought to behave in a certain way, but that's not, in fact, how they behave. All right, let's back up and try again. We want to know if there is a power behind the universe. If it exists, it would not be an observable fact in the universe, but something that makes them. The only case where we can have more than the observable facts is us. And we find that there is more than the observable facts. All right, let's try again. Other way around. The power, if there is a power outside the universe, it couldn't be one of the facts inside it. Just like a carpenter can't actually be one of the walls in his house. The only way it could show itself would be as an influence trying to get us to behave in a certain way. Shouldn't this make us suspicious? The only case where we might get an answer, the answer is yes. And you can see why you don't get an answer in the other cases. Here's an analogy from Lewis. Suppose someone asks me, when I see a man in a blue uniform going down the street, leaving little paper packets at each house, why should I suppose they contain letters? I should reply, because whenever he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. And if he then objected, but you've never seen all these letters which you think the other people are getting, I should say, of course not, and I shouldn't expect to, because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I am allowed to open. It is the same about this question. The only packet I'm allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. I do not, of course, think that if I could get inside a stone or a tree, I should find exactly the same thing, just as I do not think all the other people in the street get the same letters that I do. I should expect, for example, to find that the stone had to obey the law of gravity, That whereas the sender of the letters merely tells me to obey the law of my human nature, he compels the stone to obey the laws of its stony nature. But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. Now, we're going to stop right there. Lewis says, you might think we're going too fast, but we're not within 100 miles of the God of Christianity yet. Right now, all we've gotten to is that there is a something behind the universe, and it's interested in right and wrong. Lewis says, I think we have to assume it is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. Because after all, the only other thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions. But of course, it need not be very like a mind, still less like a person. In the next chapter, we shall see if we can find out anything more about it. But for now, that's all I have to say about that.